Who Framed Roger Rabbit from 1988 was a monumental film and stunning technical achievement, mixing animation and live action, film noir, and cartoon slapstick. And while it never received a sequel, and seems pretty unlikely by now, at least we have a handful of video games to enjoy, right? Oh dear, well, maybe these games aren't that bad. Maybe they're just drawn that way. So let's go down this 8-bit rabbit hole and check out every Roger Rabbit game. Now, the first batch of Roger Rabbit games released were for home computers in 1988, with a variety of ports for the Commodore 64, Apple II, Atari ST, Amiga, and the version I personally grew up playing on DOS. It was developed and published by Buena Vista Software, Disney's recently formed in-house game development branch, and created by Reichard von Wolfschild, whose resume would later go on to include directing the game Return Fire, hosting Invention USA on the History Channel for a couple of seasons, and helping take down Jeffrey Epstein? Anyways, taking a few cues from the story of the film, we join Roger Rabbit in a madcap search for Marvin's will before Judge Doom dissolves Toontown in Dip. All the action, danger, and excitement here is essentially crammed into 3 minigames, so obviously there's a lot missing plot-wise. Even our detective Eddie Valiant is nowhere to be seen. But efforts were at least made to reference some memorable moments from the film. The first and third levels have you riding Benny the Cab through Hollywood to reach your next destination, with traffic-filled streets and frequent puddles of ink-dissolving dip that will cost you one of your 5 lives if you hit one. Luckily, you can spring upwards to jump up over things, or even get up onto the rooftops. There are also occasional power-ups to go fast or be temporarily invulnerable, but they're kinda hard to see and pretty easy to miss. You're also racing against Judge Doom in these stages, but depending on the port you're playing, winning or losing may not really make any difference. The DOS version is especially busted in the fact that once you get up onto the buildings, you can just stay up there and face no penalty for finishing behind Doom, making this section of the game pretty trivial if you want to use this easy exploit. But your first stop in Hollywood is the Ink and Paint Club, a minigame where you have to grab numerous napkins off the dining tables in the hopes that one of them is Marvin's will. So you spin around in circles trying to reach a screen full of clear tables before the level's song ends, all while avoiding the bouncer and accidentally picking up any drinks, as alcohol sends Roger into an uncontrollable frenzy.
I needed that.
The play control here is pretty miserable across all of the ports I tried, although the Amiga version is probably the most responsive one. But again, it's kind of another trivial stage, with most versions of the game letting you continue onto the next level anyway at the cost of losing a life if you can't get enough napkins picked up. Then you'll do one more driving level, basically identical to the first, and eventually reach the final stage, the Gag Factory, where Jessica has been kidnapped and you must guide Roger through a warehouse filled with hazardous dip and weasel guards, utilizing various items and pranks to bypass them, or just make them laugh so hard that they die. Here's also where something very special comes in, and is honestly one of the most memorable things about the game for me. The game's paperwork comes with an Acme Gag catalog, a fully illustrated pamphlet full of wacky items, many of which can be found in the final stage. So reading through this can actually be of some help to figure out some of the weird puzzles here. You'll still need to do a lot of trial and error, but it's a neat touch. Besides that, it's even a form of piracy protection, as you'll need to answer a question about the catalog's contents to even play the game beyond the first stage in the first place. DRM will always be kind of annoying, but at least back then they got a little creative with it sometimes, with funky code wheels and fun stuff like this. But getting back to the final level, if you can reach the end before Judge Doom's dip cannon reaches Jessica, you'll save her, melt the judge, and walk off into the sunset like a hero. I'm happy to report 35 years later I was finally able to beat this one, as I could never figure out how to take out those weasels when I was a kid. So I've been showing the DOS version mostly here, which honestly has pretty great graphics for the time, and that PC speaker audio is trying its best. But in trying out the other ports, you're probably best off playing the Amiga version. It has the best graphics and sound by far, and the most responsive controls, and more balanced difficulty as well, with a more generous timer for the final level, and driving stages that won't let you stick to the rooftops the whole time. The Commodore 64 version also seemed pretty playable, but with the most primitive looking graphics, while the Atari ST and Apple II ports were very sludgy and borderline unplayable in comparison. Overall, it's a pretty short game if you know what to do, but quite challenging if you don't, and you could even go masochist mode and try to beat it without losing to Doom's car or failing the Ink and Paint Club stage. But if I'm being real, I wouldn't have as much interest in this game if I hadn't already had some fond memories of playing it when I was young. Next up is another childhood favorite of mine on the NES, although at the time I only knew it as Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle, while the Japanese version on the Famicom disk system released 7 months prior was Roger Rabbit. This would be the first entry in Kemco's Crazy Castle series of platforming puzzle games, with a dizzying array of interchangeable mascots depending on regions and consoles throughout the series. And this is the only one featuring Roger. By the time they looked into a Western release of this game, LJN's NES game was about to come out, on top of Capcom having dibs on North American Disney licensed games for the console at the time. So Kemco then simply did some sprite swaps to instead feature Warner Brothers characters, without any modifications to the actual gameplay. Rather than any attempt to follow the movie storyline, here your goal is simply to rescue Jessica by completing 60 short levels, collecting all the hearts in each, while avoiding weasels and other foes. It's sort of a platformer, but you're not able to jump, so it's more of a matter of finding the best route to avoid and divert enemies in various ways, sometimes using items like boxing gloves, invincibility ink, or pushable objects like safes and flower pots to take them out. Everything can kill you in one hit, so you'll have to balance strategy with some fast reflexes to navigate the rooms full of stairways, doorways, and pipes, and gather up the required hearts. Enemies are not very smart, but they have various behaviors depending on their type and sprite color, and the levels are designed in such a way to surely bend your brain a bit. Luckily, it's pretty generous with giving you an extra life after every stage, and also has a password feature, since 60 levels can be a bit exhausting and somewhat repetitive. It's a pretty simple concept and execution, but one I find very fun to pick up and play every once in a while. It's a nice blend of brain teasing with some classic arcade mentality. Its relevance to Roger Rabbit is pretty flimsy though, and when promotion for the film ended in Japan, so would Kemco's license to use him for anything else down the road. Regardless of what Rabbit sprite is on the screen, this is still a fun one to check out. And now for the most infamous game in the bunch today, we have Who Framed Roger Rabbit for the NES, released in 1989 by LJN and developed by Rare. This is one of those games that whenever it comes up in conversation, usually it's remembered as one of those weekend rentals when you were a kid and you had no clue what was going on and couldn't really figure it out on your own, especially if you hadn't seen the movie yet. So usually you just ended up punching Roger in the face over and over again, or punching anyone else in the game for that matter. But maybe if you had a chance to read the manual, you might have gained a little insight into what's happening here. So you have control of the detective character Eddie Valiant, with Roger following along, not doing much other than randomly skittering around the screen, and you'll need to explore Los Angeles and Toontown in search of the 4 missing pieces of Marvin Acme's will, switching between a side-scrolling adventure game kind of view for buildings and caves, and an overhead view for navigating the city on foot or driving around with Benny the Cab. Something actually pretty cool here for the time is the fact that the locations of the pieces of the will and other items are completely randomized with every playthrough, adding a bit of extra challenge and replayability, and not something you saw that often on the NES at that time. But this mechanic unfortunately doesn't feel fully fleshed out here, as what tends to end up happening is you just go to a building, ask someone for help, and they will usually give a canned response confirming or denying if there is an item somewhere, or they might just refuse you entirely. If there is an item, you need to slowly search every drawer, trash can, and potted plant until you find it. All while avoiding various hazards as well, like stray animals, plants falling from windowsills, or eventually some even wackier foes in Toontown. There are quite a few different items, some pretty useful and some not. There are crowbars for throwing at padlocks, a whistle to hail Benny, dynamite to open up access to new areas, items to distract enemies, and even exploding cigars and handguns. Eddie can also defend himself with his fists, but they really only work on this crazy weasel that shows up every once in a while, and on Judge Doom at the end of the game. The punching mechanics are also a bit strange, as you need to wind up your punch to do any decent amount of damage. The weasels can also cause you some problems on the overworld screen, with periodic ambushes that can trigger a little mini-game where you have to guess the correct punchline to a joke in order to fend them off. Man, if you're into bad dad jokes, this might be the best part of the game. The overworld is pretty expansive, with quite a few buildings to explore, a couple of item shops, a secret magical house, along with some wilderness areas and dark caves that you'll probably want a flashlight before entering. You can also get into the Ink and Paint Club and have a chat with Jessica, who even gives out a toll-free phone number to call, which had a recorded message from her giving some special tips for playing the game. So with the fairly large world to explore, with items and random locations in every playthrough, this one can be pretty tough, especially considering you just have a handful of lives and 2 continues. There is a password feature that helps, although what it does is retain everything in your inventory, but still randomizes the item locations again when you start. But with enough patience, you may find yourself in the final showdown with Judge Doom, while Roger and Jessica are in danger of the dip cannon slowly inching towards them. So I've beaten a few hundred NES games in my lifetime, and I can safely say this might be one of the worst final bosses I've ever encountered. Now maybe I'm not using the safest offensive technique here, but his erratic movement and irritating counter punches were so frustrating to deal with. But hey, 4 hours of trying over and over again, and finally I saved Toontown. Oh, that last punch, he walked right into it. Okay. One. Yeah. Okay. I like. Oh my god. Toontown is saved and remains in the hands of its rightful owners, the Toons. Now, I want to like this game more than I do, since I really did think the randomizer aspect had some potential, and I actually started to feel very invested in tracking down all of the pieces of the will during my playthrough. But a lot of the repetitive actions of asking for help, searching, and eliminating all possible locations can get pretty tedious. And that last boss fight feels so random that it might sour your experience further. I guess it's another one of those LJN games with very solid graphics and music. David Wise scored this one, by the way, and an unconventional gameplay concept that makes a valiant effort to pay homage to its license, but ultimately it's a bit undercooked. I'll still have some fond memories of this one though, and special shout out to Junkyard Dave, who just broke the speedrun world record for this recently. Since the game is randomized, the speedrun involves some crazy sorcery involving rubber banding the second controller, hitting a frame-perfect start button entry on the title screen, and even dealing with variances in PPU cycling per console. And then from there, it's a cascade of slot machine pulls and perfect execution. So it was a fascinating and addictive grind to watch, and it actually planted the seed in my head to check out all the other Roger Rabbit games too. Which brings me to the next game to be released, and one I did not play when I was a kid, but instead just gave it a full playthrough before making this video. It's Who Framed Roger Rabbit for the Game Boy, released 2 years later in 1991, developed and published by Capcom. Notably, this would be one of the earliest games designed by Shinji Mikami, who would go on to working on Goof Troop and Aladdin for the Super Nintendo, Oh, and some little obscure zombie game for the PS1 called Resident Evil. Again, this time the game would make efforts to follow along with the core plotline of the film, but with you in control of Roger. And the game opens up with a brief conversation with Marvin Acme, only to be interrupted by him getting shot. Even for a Game Boy Disney game, Shinji is not pulling any punches here. The gameplay takes the form of a top-down action-adventure game, comparable to a very slimmed-down take on Zelda, but with a much smaller world to navigate and more emphasis on light puzzle solving and progressing the story through character interactions. While the game sticks to Los Angeles and Toontown for its setting, it is somewhat split up into stages to provide basic checkpoints and storyline beats, and often it's a matter of triggering the right conversation with someone, finding the necessary item, and solving some kind of problem before moving on. There are weasels abound, of course, who you'll need to avoid or can also smack them around with a boxing glove weapon. And some rooms will even require a bit of strategy and stealthiness to get through safely. There are a couple of basic boss fights as well, so there's a solid balance of using your reflexes and your brain. But overall, the game isn't super difficult, and very generous with unlimited continues, but I will admit to getting stumped for a little while at times. Usually it was just a matter of not talking to the right person, however. Still, it was a fun and entertaining romp, and cool to see the early frameworks for Shinji's future titles, Goof Troop especially, which is a great top-down action puzzle game if you haven't tried it yet. And this definitely has that Capcom polish with nice graphics and sound, so I'd certainly recommend this one for anyone looking for something to pop into their Game Boy for an afternoon or two. And the final game in our list was also released in 1991 and was one I wasn't even aware of until beginning my video research. Hare Havoc, released for DOS and Amiga and developed by Blue Sky Software.
Hey, yes, ma'am. Aye, sir. Okie dokie. I'll take care of him like he was my own brother, or my own sister, or my brother's sister, or my second cousin who was twice removed.
Rather than treading familiar ground with another movie adaptation, this game takes a crack at the spirit of the wacky hijinks of the Roger Rabbit animated shorts instead, as you're tasked with babysitting baby Herman, who naturally escapes out the window within seconds. And as Roger, you'll need to figure out your way through various Rube Goldberg-like settings, all with the clock ticking down until the mother's return. You can't die, but failure will happen often due to the somewhat harsh time limit. But at least the director of the cartoon will keep letting you have a second take.
Roger, the script says Roger has baby Herman back when Mommy gets home. Can't you do anything right?
In playing this one, I was immediately taken aback by the great graphics and detailed animations on both versions, but especially in the Amiga version we're looking at here. Gameplay is more in line with classic adventure games, but very stripped down, and only having one button to interact with your environment, and moving Roger around with the arrow keys or joystick. Solving your way out of each room amounts to just trying stuff and seeing what happens. And with enough attempts, you'll gradually piece together the correct order of absurd actions and sometimes precise timing needed to pull them off. Logic is sometimes thrown out the window, of course. You have to remember this is a wacky cartoon world. As an example, to escape the bathroom, you have to put a towel on the floor, throw a bar of soap in the sink, slip on the soap, put it in the toilet, turn on the fan, stick a plunger to the wall, leap into the toilet, and fly out of the skylight window in a bubble.
I'm coming, baby!
It's pretty entertaining stuff once you figure it out, but can get frustrating if you get stuck. With enough patience, the game reaches a brutal culmination at the milk factory, where the difficulty ramps up considerably as you must control the bottling machine to produce enough milk bottles to stack up high enough to reach a high window. Each bottle needs to be cleaned, filled with milk, topped with a rubber nipple, and labeled, all while you're panicking about how much time is left on the clock. Good luck here. It's no NES Judge Doom, but this will test your gamer skills, no doubt. I guess at this point I should mention the controls not being as responsive as they probably could be, which may be a side effect of the detailed animation cycles. So any precise actions in the game do take a bit of practice, and unfortunately there are no checkpoints. But the game is fairly short if you know all of the solutions, so I guess I can see why they made you start over in efforts to make the game last a bit longer. But I certainly had some fun figuring this one out. It's definitely worth a playthrough for Roger fans or anyone into wacky adventure games.
I'm coming, baby Herman! Gotcha! Woo!
And that's the last we would see of Roger Rabbit in video game form, a character seemingly swept under the rug by Disney at this point. I guess some of the adult themes might be a bit risky to rework into kid-friendly material these days, and it's hard to imagine seeing Mickey and Bugs Bunny on the screen at the same time ever again. But it's still somewhat surprising that such a phenomenal film never got a proper follow-up. At the same time, perhaps some things are better left as a standalone achievement without tarnishing its legacy in the pursuit of consumerism. Now, it's arguable whether these games tarnished that or not, but I do feel like each one at least made a nice effort to capture the spirit of the film, even if the execution of the gameplay wasn't always up to par. Thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this, I've made a few other videos on 80s and 90s licensed games that might be up your alley as well. And we'll catch you next time.
Come on, Roger, let's go home. I'll bake you a carrot cake.